The most expensive mistake a company can make is firing the man who built its success without knowing who he really is. The sound of impact wrenches echoed through the vast Hayes Motorsport facility as dozens of mechanics and engineers moved between race cars worth millions of dollars. The national championship race was only 3 weeks away, and every department was operating under pressure. At the center of the garage, Ethan Walker stood beside a partially disassembled engine, his hands darkened by hours of work. He was not supposed to be touching it, at least, not according to the new policy. The engine belonged to the team's newest race car, a machine that had spent 6 months in development and consumed an enormous budget. Earlier that morning, one of the lead engineers had reported an unusual vibration during testing. The official procedure required approval from management before any modifications could be made. Ethan had ignored the procedure, not because he was careless, because he already knew what was wrong. He quietly removed a component, adjusted a measurement no thicker than a few sheets of paper, and began reassembling the engine. Around him, younger mechanics watched with curiosity. Most of them respected Ethan. He rarely spoke about himself, never took credit, and somehow always knew what was causing a problem before anyone else. Then the garage suddenly became quiet. Victoria Hayes had arrived. The new CEO moved through the facility with confident purpose. At 31 years old, she had inherited leadership after her father's retirement and was determined to prove she belonged there. She believed discipline created excellence. She believed procedures existed for a reason. And she believed nobody was above the rules. Her eyes immediately settled on Ethan working on the engine. "Who authorized this?" she asked. Nobody answered. Several employees exchanged nervous glances. Ethan continued tightening a fastener before finally looking up. "The car needed a correction," he said calmly. Victoria crossed her arms. "That was not my question." Ethan stood and wiped his hands on a shop towel. "No one authorized it." The silence deepened. Victoria's expression hardened. "You ignored engineering approval, bypassed protocol, and modified a championship vehicle without permission." Ethan said nothing. To her, the silence sounded like confirmation. To everyone else, it felt different. "Turn in your badge," Victoria said. A mechanic near the back of the garage looked down at the floor. Another slowly shook his head. Ethan simply removed the badge from his shirt and placed it on a nearby workbench. No argument, no explanation, no defense. Victoria interpreted his calmness as indifference. She did not notice the expressions around her. She did not notice that several senior employees looked genuinely alarmed. Ethan picked up his worn jacket and headed toward the exit. As he disappeared through the garage doors, nobody realized they had just watched the most important person in the building walk away. The garage doors closed behind Ethan Walker, and the noise of Hayes Motorsport faded into the distance. He crossed the parking lot carrying nothing but his jacket and a small toolbox that looked older than some of the race cars inside the facility. He did not look back. Most people would have. Most people would have felt anger, humiliation, or the need to defend themselves. Ethan simply kept walking. Inside the garage, work resumed, but not normally. Conversations became quieter. Mechanics exchanged uncertain looks. Several engineers stared toward the exit long after Ethan was gone. Near the rear of the facility, a young design engineer named Tyler Grant returned to his workstation. He had joined the company only 8 months earlier and still spent most of his time reviewing technical archives and testing data. As he sat down, he noticed a rolled blueprint partially sticking out from a storage cabinet left open during the morning confusion. Curious, he pulled it free. The paper was old, much older than the digital systems currently used by the company. Across the bottom corner sat a signature line. Tyler frowned. He looked closer. The name printed there was Ethan Walker. He unrolled another blueprint stored behind it. Same name. Then another. Same result. Tyler stared at the documents. These were not minor projects. They were championship-winning chassis designs from years earlier. He glanced toward the office windows above the garage floor where Victoria Hayes was meeting with department managers. She looked confident, determined, certain of her decision. Tyler considered saying something. Instead, he quietly returned the drawings to the cabinet. Meanwhile, Victoria sat at the head of a conference table reviewing preparation schedules for the upcoming championship race. Every department reported progress. Aerodynamics, tire strategy, marketing, sponsorship relations. Everything appeared under control, exactly how she wanted it. Then the lead performance engineer entered carrying a diagnostic report. "We have a small issue with the new car," he said. Victoria barely looked up. "How small?" "Probably nothing serious." He placed the report on the table. The engine vibration returned during testing. Victoria glanced at the numbers. "I thought that was already resolved." The engineer hesitated, only briefly. "It was being examined." Victoria nodded and moved on to the next agenda item. The conversation continued. Budgets, schedules, travel logistics. Yet the report remained on the table untouched. Across town, Ethan drove toward a modest neighborhood lined with maple trees, beginning to change color. School would be out in less than an hour. His daughter would be waiting. For the first time all day, his expression softened slightly. Whatever happened at the garage could wait. Then his phone vibrated on the passenger seat. The caller identification displayed Hayes Motorsport. Ethan looked at the screen for several seconds. The call stopped before he answered. Moments later, another call followed. Different extension, same company. Ethan let that one ring out as well. When Ethan pulled into the school pickup lane, Sophie Walker was already sitting on a bench near the front entrance with a book resting on her lap. The moment she saw his truck, she smiled and stood. That smile accomplished something the entire day had failed to do. It made him forget the garage for a few seconds. Sophie climbed into the passenger seat and immediately noticed something different. Children often noticed things adults missed. "You are home early," she said. Ethan started the engine. "Looks that way." Sophie buckled her seatbelt and studied him carefully. "Did something happen?" Ethan glanced toward her and then back to the road. "Work changed plans." Sophie seemed to think about that answer. Was it a good change or a bad change? Ethan almost smiled, still figuring that out. She accepted the response and opened her book. The conversation ended there. Across town, the atmosphere inside Hayes Motorsport was becoming less comfortable. The vibration issue that had appeared during testing was no longer being dismissed as a minor concern. Engineers had run multiple simulations. None of the results agreed with one another. Some suggested a calibration problem. Others pointed toward a mechanical imbalance. Several senior specialists gathered around diagnostic screens, each offering different theories. None produced a solution. By late afternoon, another test run had been canceled. Victoria Hayes received the update while reviewing sponsorship contracts. "How long until it is fixed?" she asked. The lead performance engineer hesitated. "We are still evaluating the cause." Victoria lowered the document she was reading. "That is not what I asked." The engineer shifted uncomfortably. "We do not know yet." It was the first answer she had heard all day that she genuinely disliked. Meanwhile, Tyler Grant returned to the storage cabinet after everyone else left for the evening. Curiosity had refused to leave him alone. One blueprint had become 5. 5 had become 20. Every document told the same story: championship chassis, suspension systems, aerodynamic packages, historic race-winning platforms. Ethan Walker's name appeared everywhere. Tyler finally sat back in disbelief. The company museum displayed trophies won over 15 years, yet nobody ever talked about the man whose signature seemed attached to half the machines responsible for those victories. Back at the apartment, Ethan prepared dinner while Sophie worked on homework at the kitchen table. The space was small but warm. Framed photographs lined a shelf near the window. One image showed a much younger Ethan standing beside an unfinished race car. Another showed him holding a trophy. Sophie glanced toward the photograph. "You never told me if you won that race." Ethan looked at the picture for a moment. "The car won." Sophie frowned. "That is not the same thing." Ethan set a plate on the table. "Sometimes it is." His phone vibrated again. Hayes Motorsport. Third call today. Ethan looked at the screen. This time the caller left a voicemail. He did not listen to it. Not yet. The following morning began with optimism that lasted less than an hour. The championship prototype rolled onto the private test track beneath clear skies, while engineers gathered behind monitoring stations. Victoria Hayes stood beside the timing wall watching preparations with her usual confidence. The vibration issue had consumed valuable time, but several specialists believed they had finally isolated the source. New adjustments had been installed overnight. Fresh data had been loaded into the control systems. Everyone expected improvement. The driver completed the first lap without incident. The second looked promising. Then, halfway through the third lap, warning indicators began appearing across multiple screens. The driver immediately reported unusual behavior through the radio. Within seconds, the test was halted. Silence settled across the timing wall. Engineers stared at incoming telemetry. Nobody spoke at first. The numbers spoke for them. The problem had not disappeared. It had become worse. Victoria folded her arms and watched the lead engineers review the data. "Tell me what happened." The response took longer than she liked. "We are still analyzing it." It was the same answer she had heard yesterday. This time it sounded even less convincing. Hours passed. Teams reviewed simulations. Components were removed and inspected. Alternative theories appeared and disappeared. Every solution created a new contradiction. By early afternoon, frustration had spread through the garage. Sponsors expected results. Media representatives were asking questions. The championship race was getting closer. Yet nobody could explain why the car behaved perfectly in one test and unpredictably in the next. Meanwhile, Tyler Grant continued examining archived engineering records. What had started as curiosity was becoming an obsession. He discovered notebooks, design revisions, and development reports stretching back more than a decade. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Whenever a critical problem threatened the team, Ethan Walker's name surfaced somewhere nearby. Tyler opened another file and froze. It contained the original development notes for the current championship prototype. Near the beginning sat a short comment written years earlier. If vibration emerges under load, inspect the secondary alignment before replacing primary systems. Tyler immediately compared the note to the repairs engineers had spent 2 days attempting. None of them had checked the alignment Ethan referenced. Not one. Across town, Ethan spent the afternoon helping Sophie assemble a model race car for a school project. Small plastic pieces covered the kitchen table. Sophie concentrated intensely while Ethan quietly followed the instructions. "You always know how things fit together," she said. Ethan looked at the unfinished model. "Most things leave clues." Sophie nodded as though that made perfect sense. His phone vibrated once more. Another voicemail from the company. Then another. Ethan turned the screen face down and returned his attention to the model. Back at Hayes Motorsport, Tyler stared at Ethan's old engineering note while the realization slowly settled over him. The answer might have been sitting in the building all along. The only problem was that the person who wrote it was no longer there. The next 2 days became a parade of expensive failures. Hayes Motorsport brought in specialists from 3 different racing programs. Veteran engine consultants reviewed data logs. Performance analysts compared telemetry from previous seasons. Designers inspected every component that could possibly influence the vibration. Each expert arrived confident. Each expert left frustrated. The prototype remained unpredictable. During one test session, it appeared stable. During the next, it developed the same problem all over again. The inconsistency made the situation worse. Nobody could isolate a cause because the evidence seemed to change every time they looked at it. Victoria Hayes spent more time in the garage than in her office. The championship race was less than 3 weeks away, and sponsors were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Reporters had started noticing canceled test sessions. Investors wanted reassurance. Every morning, Victoria expected progress. Every evening, she received another report explaining why progress had not happened. Late Friday afternoon, Tyler Grant finally gathered enough courage to approach the lead performance engineer. He carried a stack of copied documents under one arm. "You should look at these," he said. The engineer barely glanced up. "What are they?" "Old development records. We already checked historical data." Tyler placed the papers on the desk anyway. "Not this data." The engineer reluctantly began flipping through the pages. His expression changed after the 3rd document, then after the 5th, then after the 10th. Every page contained detailed notes from Ethan Walker. Not broad theories, precise observations, exact measurements, predictions of future problems, solutions written years before the problems actually appeared. The engineer slowly looked up. "Where did you find these?" "Archive storage." "How many are there?" Tyler hesitated. "Hundreds." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Across the facility, mechanics prepared another test vehicle while discussions grew increasingly tense. Nobody noticed the lead engineer walking quickly toward the executive offices carrying Ethan's documents. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the evening helping Sophie practice for a school presentation. She stood in the living room reading from index cards while he listened from the couch. Whenever she forgot a line, she stopped and started again. "You never get upset when I make mistakes," Sophie said. Ethan looked up from his coffee. "Everybody makes mistakes." "Even race car builders?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Especially race car builders." Sophie smiled and continued reading. His phone vibrated again. This time it was not a voicemail. It was a text message from an unknown number. Only one sentence appeared on the screen. "Did you really design the championship prototype?" Ethan stared at the message for several seconds. Then he set the phone down without replying. Back at Hayes Motorsport, Victoria was opening Ethan's engineering records for the first time. By the end of the first page, she stopped reading and simply stared at the signature at the bottom. Victoria Hayes remained in her office long after most employees had gone home. The stack of engineering records sat spread across her desk. At first, she had expected to find evidence of a talented engineer. Instead, she found something far more unsettling. Every major breakthrough from the past 15 years seemed connected to Ethan Walker. Championship-winning suspension systems, aerodynamic improvements, engine reliability solutions, development platforms that were still being used today. The deeper she read, the clearer the pattern became. Ethan's work was everywhere. Yet his name appeared almost nowhere in public presentations, interviews, or company announcements. It was as though he had spent years building the foundation of the organization while deliberately staying invisible. The following morning, Victoria called an emergency technical review. Department heads filled the conference room. Engineers arrived carrying laptops and diagnostic reports. The atmosphere felt different now, less confident, more cautious. Victoria placed one of Ethan's engineering notebooks on the table. "I want answers," she said. "How much of our current race program came from him?" Nobody responded immediately. Finally, the lead performance engineer cleared his throat. "More than we realized." Another engineer spoke next. "Possibly much more." The room fell silent. Tyler Grant sat near the back and listened. For the first time, senior employees were saying out loud what many had quietly suspected for years. Then a new diagnostic report appeared on the main screen. The prototype had failed another simulation overnight. Several projected race scenarios now ended with performance losses significant enough to eliminate any realistic championship hopes. Victoria stared at the numbers. "Can anyone solve this?" The question hung in the air. No one answered, not because they were unwilling, because they honestly did not know. Meanwhile, Ethan spent Saturday morning helping Sophie clean out the small storage unit behind their apartment building. Boxes filled with old racing parts lined the shelves. Worn trophies collected dust in corners. Sophie opened one box and pulled out a framed photograph. "You were younger," she said. Ethan glanced at the image. A much younger version of himself stood beside a race car, surrounded by smiling team members. "That happens," he replied. Sophie looked closer. "You built that one too?" Ethan nodded. She studied the picture for a moment. "You build a lot of things." Ethan smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Back at Hayes Motorsport, another discovery was creating fresh concern. Engineers had begun tracing the origins of the prototype's design architecture. Every path led to the same place: Ethan's original development files. The realization spread through the building one department at a time. By late afternoon, even employees who had never worked directly with him understood the truth. The race car everyone was trying to save had been built on a system designed by the very man no longer working there. And with every failed attempt to fix it, that truth became harder to ignore. By Monday morning, the atmosphere inside Hayes Motorsport had shifted from concern to urgency. The championship countdown clock hanging above the main garage suddenly felt much larger than before. Every employee who looked at it saw the same thing: time disappearing. The prototype sat in the center of the facility, surrounded by engineers, laptops, diagnostic equipment, and growing frustration. Nobody lacked talent. Nobody lacked effort. Yet every attempt to solve the problem led back to the same dead end. Victoria Hayes stood on the observation platform overlooking the garage floor. Below her, teams moved between workstations while conversations remained short and tense. The confidence that had once defined the organization seemed to be slipping away a little more each day. Then Tyler Grant arrived carrying another stack of archived records. He placed them on the conference table and opened several pages. "You need to see this." Victoria looked down. The documents contained development notes connected to nearly every successful race program the company had launched during the last decade. Beside countless technical observations sat the same signature: Ethan Walker. Again, and again, and again. One senior engineer slowly leaned back in his chair. "This is impossible." Tyler shook his head. "No. What is impossible is how nobody noticed. More records appeared: original suspension architecture, chassis integration strategies, engine balancing procedures. Even the diagnostic framework currently being used to analyze the prototype carried traces of Ethan's work. The room fell silent. For years, people had viewed him as a skilled employee. What they were discovering now was something very different. He had not simply contributed to the racing program, he had shaped it. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan spent the afternoon at a small local kart track where Sophie attended a youth racing event. Children drove tiny machines around a simple circuit, while parents watched from folding chairs near the fence.
Sophie sat beside her father eating a pretzel. "Do you miss racing?" she asked. Ethan watched the track for a moment before answering, "Sometimes." "Why did you stop?" Ethan considered the question. "Some things become less important." Sophie followed his gaze toward the young drivers. "What became more important?" Ethan looked at her. "You?" Sophie smiled and returned her attention to the race. Back at Hayes Motorsport, another discovery arrived before sunset. An engineer reviewing prototype architecture uncovered the original master development file. The document identified the lead architect responsible for creating the entire technical platform that supported the current race car. Victoria stared at the screen as though reading it for the first time would somehow change the result.
It did not. The name remained the same: Ethan Walker. Not one of the builders, not one contributor among many. The architect. The realization moved through the company like a wave. By evening, everyone understood the same uncomfortable truth. They were trying to save a machine designed by the one person who understood it better than anyone else. And he was no longer there. Early Tuesday evening, Victoria Hayes parked her car in front of a modest apartment building she never would have imagined visiting a week earlier. The address sat on a folded piece of paper resting on the passenger seat. For several moments, she remained inside the vehicle, staring at the entrance. She had negotiated sponsorship contracts worth millions of dollars. She had addressed investors, executives, and media organizations without hesitation. Yet walking into this building felt strangely difficult. Finally, she stepped out and climbed the stairs. Apartment 3B. She knocked once. A few seconds later, the door opened. Sophie Walker stood there holding a sketchbook against her chest. "Hello," she said politely. Victoria blinked. "Hello." Before she could say anything else, Ethan appeared behind his daughter. His expression remained calm. No surprise, no anger, no satisfaction. Just the same steady composure he carried everywhere. "Can we talk?" Victoria asked. Ethan glanced toward Sophie. "Why do not you finish your drawing?" Sophie nodded and walked toward the kitchen table. Ethan opened the door wider. Victoria stepped inside. The apartment was simple, clean, comfortable. Family photographs covered one wall. School projects sat on a bookshelf. A partially assembled model race car rested on the kitchen table beside colored pencils. Nothing inside suggested the man living there had designed championship-winning machines for years. Yet somehow, everything inside explained who he was better than any personnel file ever could. Victoria sat down. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she placed a folder on the table. "I know now." Ethan looked at the folder but did not open it. "Know what?" "That you built far more than anyone realized." Ethan remained silent. Victoria continued. "The prototype, the development platform, the systems behind our most successful cars. The records are everywhere." Ethan folded his hands. "Records have a way of surviving." The answer carried no pride, no bitterness, just fact. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly.
I made a mistake. Ethan did not rush to rescue her from the discomfort. The silence lingered. Finally, she continued. The car is getting worse. Nobody can solve it. Ethan looked toward the model race car Sophie had been assembling. Did they check the secondary alignment? Victoria hesitated. They did yesterday. And? The vibration decreased. Ethan nodded slightly. Then there is a second issue. Victoria stared at him. The answer had arrived instantly. No reports, no simulations, no meetings. Just understanding. For the first time, she truly grasped how different he was from everyone else trying to solve the problem. Across the room, Sophie looked up from her drawing. Daddy fixes things. Victoria followed her gaze. Sophie smiled. He always does. The words were simple, yet they carried more certainty than every expert opinion Victoria had heard all week. Her phone suddenly vibrated. A message from the garage appeared on the screen. Another test had failed. The championship countdown now showed less than 2 weeks remaining. Victoria slowly looked back at Ethan. For the first time since becoming chief executive, she was no longer asking whether she needed his help. She was wondering how the company had ever functioned without fully understanding his value. The next morning, Ethan Walker walked back into Hayes Motorsport carrying the same worn toolbox he had carried out days earlier. Nothing about him looked different. The building, however, felt completely different. Conversations stopped as he crossed the garage floor. Mechanics looked up from workstations. Engineers stepped aside. Nobody announced his arrival. Nobody needed to. The silence spread ahead of him. Victoria Hayes stood near the prototype waiting. For a moment she seemed ready to say something. Then she simply nodded. Ethan returned the gesture and continued toward the car. There was no ceremony, no speech, no discussion about the past. He placed the toolbox on a workbench and removed a small flashlight. Within minutes, he was examining areas dozens of specialists had already inspected. The difference was not effort. It was familiarity. Ethan looked at the machine the way an architect looks at a building he designed himself. Every line meant something. Every component told a story. Engineers gathered nearby while he worked. Occasionally, he asked a short question, a measurement, a test result, a recent adjustment. Then he returned to studying the car. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, Ethan stood and pointed toward a section deep within the assembly. There. Several engineers leaned closer. One frowned. We checked that. Ethan nodded. You checked the component. He tapped another area. You did not check what was affecting it. The garage became silent again. The lead performance engineer followed Ethan's explanation and slowly realized what everyone else had missed. One small alignment issue had triggered a chain of secondary effects that disguised the true source of the problem. The fix itself was surprisingly simple. Understanding why it existed was not. Within the hour, adjustments were completed. The prototype rolled onto the test track one final time. Employees gathered along observation windows. Victoria stood beside Tyler Grant and several department heads. Nobody spoke. The driver accelerated onto the circuit. One lap, then another, then another. Telemetry streamed across monitoring screens. Every indicator remained stable. The vibration never returned. A mechanic quietly removed his glasses. Another engineer simply shook his hand. Months of confusion had disappeared because one man understood the machine at a level nobody else could reach. Back inside the garage, Ethan closed his toolbox. The work was finished.
Victoria approached him. "Thank you," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Take care of the team." The words surprised her. No mention of himself, no demand, no condition. Just concern for the people still working there. Then Sophie appeared near the garage entrance, having arrived with a family friend after school. She spotted her father immediately. "Dad!" she called. Ethan turned. Sophie smiled. "Are we going home now?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "Yeah," he said. "We are." Together they walked toward the exit. Behind them stood engineers, managers, mechanics, and executives surrounded by machines he had helped create. Nobody tried to stop him. They simply watched. For the first time, they understood the value of the quiet man who never asked for recognition. And for Ethan, that understanding was enough.